The rain had stopped hours ago, but the streets still glistened under the amber glow of the streetlights. Vincent Marcello sat in the back of his car, staring out at the city that bent to his will, yet tonight felt strangely indifferent to his presence. His driver knew better than to speak. The silence between them was thick, familiar, the kind that came after nights that blurred into early mornings. Vincent's tie hung loose around his neck, his shirt wrinkled in a way that would have bothered him under different circumstances. But tonight, or rather this morning, he felt detached, as if observing himself from a distance. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment he paid for but never called home, a woman was likely still asleep in sheets that smelled of expensive cologne and regret. He didn't think about her now. He thought about nothing, really, which was unusual for a man who controlled every detail of his empire with ruthless precision. The car turned onto the tree-lined street where his actual home stood, a sprawling estate hidden behind iron gates and old money. Vincent closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. He would shower, change, and be in his office by 9. Everything would continue as it always had. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. But plans, even those crafted by men who believed themselves untouchable, can crumble in the face of something far quieter than violence. They can dissolve in the silence of a decision already made, in the careful steps of someone who stopped asking questions months ago. Vincent didn't know it yet, but the life he thought he controlled had already ended. The marriage he assumed would endure because it always had, because she had always stayed, because leaving him seemed impossible, had been severed not with confrontation, but with preparation. While he spent the night wrapped in the illusion of escape, his wife had been completing the final arrangements of her own. The gates opened smoothly as the car approached. The house was dark except for a single light in the kitchen, which was normal. Vincent assumed she was asleep. She usually was when he returned at this hour. He thanked his driver with a curt nod and stepped out into the cool morning air. His shoes crunched softly on the gravel as he approached the front door. He unlocked it, stepped inside, and was met with a silence that felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping household. It was the hollow absence of something that had been there before but wasn't anymore. He paused in the entryway, frowning slightly, though he couldn't immediately identify what felt wrong. The air was still. The faint scent of her perfume, which usually lingered in the hallways, was gone. He walked through the foyer into the living room. Everything looked the same at first glance. The furniture was in place, the paintings on the walls, the vases on the mantel. But as his eyes adjusted, he began to notice the gaps. The small bronze sculpture she loved was missing from the side table. The stack of books she kept by her favorite chair was gone. The throw blanket she always draped over the sofa, the one her mother had made, wasn't there. Vincent's pulse quickened. He moved faster now through the dining room, into the kitchen. The light he'd seen from outside was a lamp on the counter, left on deliberately. Next to it was an envelope. His name was written on the front in her handwriting, neat and composed. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. Inside were the divorce papers, already signed. No letter, no explanation, just the legal dissolution of a marriage, efficient and final. His hands trembled slightly as he set the papers down. He walked upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, though he already knew what he would find. Their bedroom was untouched on his side. His clothes still hung in the closet, his watch on the nightstand, but her side was empty. The closet doors stood open, revealing bare hangers. Her dresser drawers had been cleared. The bathroom counter, once cluttered with her lotions and makeup, was wiped clean. She was gone, completely, as if she had never been there at all. Vincent sat on the edge of the bed, the papers still in his hand, and tried to piece together when this had happened. When had she decided? When had she stopped fighting, stopped caring, stopped waiting for him to come home? He thought back over the past months, searching for the moment he should have noticed, the warning sign he'd missed. But the truth was, he hadn't been looking. He'd been too consumed with his own world, his own needs, his own belief that she would always be there because she always had been. He thought of the nights he'd spent away, the excuses he'd given, the phone calls he'd ignored. He thought of the way she'd stopped asking where he'd been, stopped mentioning the late nights, stopped reaching for him when he finally came to bed. He'd mistaken her silence for acceptance, her calm for contentment. But silence, he was beginning to understand, was not forgiveness. It was the sound of someone letting go. Months earlier, the signs had been there, though Vincent hadn't seen them. His wife, Alina, had stopped asking questions not because she trusted him, but because she no longer needed answers. She had already found them. It started with small inconsistencies: a receipt from a restaurant they'd never been to together, a faint scent on his collar that wasn't her perfume, late-night texts he thought he'd been discreet about. At first, she told herself she was imagining things. Marriage to a man like Vincent required a certain willingness to look the other way, to accept that his world operated by different rules. But intuition is a persistent thing, especially in a woman who had spent years learning to read the unspoken. She began to pay closer attention, not in an obvious way. She didn't rifle through his belongings or demand explanations. She simply watched. She noticed the patterns, the nights he claimed to be handling business but came home smelling of wine instead of whiskey, the way he checked his phone compulsively, smiling at messages he never shared, the distance in his eyes even when he was physically present. One afternoon, while running errands in a part of the city she rarely visited, Alina saw them, Vincent and a woman she didn't recognize, walking out of a building together. The woman laughed at something he said, touching his arm in a way that spoke of familiarity, of intimacy. Vincent glanced around cautiously before leaning down to kiss her forehead, a gesture so tender it felt like a betrayal far deeper than the physical. Alina didn't confront them. She didn't cry or scream or demand an explanation right there on the street. She simply watched from across the road, her heart breaking quietly, methodically, and then she turned and walked away. That was the moment the marriage ended, though Vincent would never know it. Not for months, not until it was far too late. From that day forward, Alina began preparing. She consulted a lawyer, someone outside Vincent's network, someone who understood the need for discretion. She learned about her rights, about what she was entitled to, about how to protect herself legally and financially from a man whose power extended into places most people couldn't reach. She opened her own bank account, quietly transferring funds she had access to into a place he couldn't touch. She contacted old friends she'd lost contact with over the years, rebuilding connections she would need when she finally left. She made lists, sorted through belongings, decided what mattered and what didn't. Every decision was made calmly, without anger, without drama. She didn't want revenge, she wanted freedom, and freedom, she realized, required preparation. At the same time, Vincent's nights with his lover, Gabriella, grew more frequent. She was younger, vibrant, full of laughter and light, in a way that felt intoxicating after years of the quiet, steady presence of his wife. Gabriella didn't ask difficult questions or expect emotional depth. She was easy, uncomplicated, a reprieve from the weight of his responsibilities. She lived in an apartment he'd secured for her, wore jewelry he'd bought, and believed, in the way that mistresses often do, that one day she would be chosen, that one day he would leave his wife and they would have something real. Vincent never promised her this outright, but he didn't discourage the fantasy either. It served him to let her believe. It made the nights they spent together feel less like betrayal and more like a preview of some future possibility. But Gabriella didn't understand the cost of being involved with a man like Vincent. She didn't see the manipulation in his tenderness and the selfishness in his affection. She didn't realize that to him, she was not a person but a function, a place to escape when the weight of his real life became too heavy. She thought she was special. She thought she was different. She thought she was loved. And because she thought these things, she stayed, night after night, believing that patience would eventually be rewarded. Vincent, for his part, convinced himself that he was managing both worlds skillfully. He believed he could keep his marriage intact while indulging in the comfort Gabriella provided. He thought his wife didn't know, or if she did, that she had chosen to accept it as part of the life she'd signed up for. He thought he was in control. But control is an illusion, especially when it's built on the silence of someone who has stopped fighting. Alina didn't confront Vincent because confrontation would have given him the opportunity to lie, to manipulate, to convince her to stay. She didn't want to be convinced. She wanted to leave. And so she moved through the final months of their marriage like a ghost, present but not really there, kind but not warm, performing the rituals of wifehood without any of the emotional investment. She attended dinners, smiled at his associates, kept the house running smoothly. To anyone observing from the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, she had already gone.
The outside, nothing had changed, but inside, she had already gone. The night Vincent spent with Gabriella, the night that would become the invisible turning point, was unremarkable in most ways. They had dinner at a restaurant tucked away in a neighborhood where no one would recognize him. They drank wine, laughed at stories that felt important in the moment but would be forgotten by morning. Gabriella leaned across the table, her eyes bright with affection, and told him she loved him. Vincent smiled, squeezed her hand, and said something vague and comforting that wasn't quite a reciprocation but felt close enough. Later, in the apartment, they made love with the kind of intensity that felt profound but was really just familiarity dressed up as passion. Afterward, she fell asleep against his chest, and Vincent lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange emptiness he couldn't name. He thought about going home. He thought about his wife, alone in their bed, probably asleep by now. He thought about the life he'd built, the empire he'd constructed, the power he wielded, and he thought about how none of it felt like enough. But instead of examining that feeling, he pushed it aside, as he always did, and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. While Vincent slept beside his lover, Alina was finishing the last of her preparations. She had already moved most of her belongings to a storage unit earlier that week, taking only small amounts at a time so he wouldn't notice. Tonight, she packed the final essentials, the things she couldn't leave behind. Photographs of her parents, a few pieces of jewelry that had sentimental value, books she'd read and reread over the years. She moved through the house quietly, efficiently, saying silent goodbyes to rooms that had once felt like home, but now felt like a prison she was finally escaping. She left the divorce papers on the kitchen counter, signed and finalized, along with a set of keys. She didn't write a letter. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had been said in the silence of the past months, in the absence of confrontation, in the careful distance she'd maintained. She didn't hate him. She didn't even blame him, not entirely. She simply understood that she deserved more than he was capable of giving, and she was choosing herself. By the time the sun began to rise, Alina was gone. She drove away from the house with a sense of relief so profound it almost felt like grief. She didn't look back. She didn't cry. She didn't second-guess her decision. She simply drove towards a life she would build on her own terms, free from the weight of a marriage that had died long before it was legally dissolved. Vincent spent the morning after his return trying to make sense of what had happened. He called her phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. He contacted people who might know where she was, but no one had answers, or if they did, they weren't sharing. He went through the house again, searching for clues, for something he'd missed, for any indication of where she'd gone. But there was nothing. She had been thorough. She had planned this carefully, and she had left no room for negotiation or reconciliation. The realization settled over him slowly, heavily, like a weight pressing down on his chest. She wasn't coming back. This wasn't a fight they would resolve. This wasn't a dramatic exit meant to make a point. This was final. In the days that followed, Vincent tried to continue as if nothing had changed. He went to his office, attended meetings, managed his operations with the same ruthless efficiency he always had. But the house felt different now. It felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the missing belongings and everything to do with the absence of the person who had made it a home. He found himself thinking about Alina constantly, replaying moments from their marriage, searching for the point where things had gone wrong. He remembered the early years, when she'd looked at him with something close to admiration, when she'd believed in him despite knowing what he was. He remembered the gradual erosion of that belief, the way her eyes had dimmed over time, the way she'd stopped reaching for him, stopped confiding in him, stopped being present even when she was physically there. He had mistaken her endurance for loyalty, her silence for acceptance. He had assumed she would always stay because leaving him seemed impossible. but she had done the impossible. She had left, and she had done it so quietly, so completely, that he hadn't even seen it coming. Gabriella noticed the change in him. He still came to see her, but he was distant, distracted, present in body but absent in every other way. She asked him what was wrong, and he told her nothing, but she didn't believe him. She could feel the shift, the way he looked at her now with something closer to regret than affection. She asked him if he was having second thoughts, if he was going back to his wife, and he told her his wife was gone. Gabriella felt a surge of something that might have been hope, but when she suggested they could finally be together properly, Vincent didn't respond the way she expected. He didn't pull her close and promise her a future. He simply looked at her with tired eyes and said nothing. That silence told her everything she needed to know. She wasn't the prize. She had never been the prize. She had been the escape. And now that the thing he was escaping from was gone, she no longer served a purpose. Weeks passed, then months. The divorce was finalized without contest. Alina had asked for nothing beyond what was legally hers, and Vincent, too exhausted to fight, let the lawyers handle everything. He never saw her again. He heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to another city, that she was doing well, that she seemed happy. He wanted to reach out, to apologize, to explain, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The apology she had needed years ago, and he hadn't given it. The explanation she might have wanted, she no longer cared to hear. She had moved on, and he was left with the hollow realization that power, money, and control meant nothing when measured against the quiet dignity of someone who had chosen to walk away. Vincent stopped seeing Gabriella, not dramatically, not with an explanation, but gradually, the way relationships built on illusion tend to end. She called less, and he answered less, and eventually the calls stopped altogether. He heard later that she had moved on, found someone else, someone who could offer her what he never could. He felt no jealousy, no sense of loss. If anything, he felt relieved that she had found a way out, that she hadn't wasted more years waiting for something that was never going to happen. He spent more time alone now. The house remained empty except for him and the staff who came and went without ever really seeing him. He moved through the rooms like a stranger, haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of a presence that was no longer there. He thought about Alina often, about the life they might have had if he'd been different, if he'd paid attention, if he'd valued what he had instead of always chasing what he didn't. But regret, he was learning, is a useless emotion. It changes nothing. It brings no one back. It simply sits heavy in the chest, a constant reminder of choices that can't be undone. One evening, Vincent found himself standing in the bedroom they had once shared, holding the divorce papers she had left behind. He read through them carefully, as if expecting to find some hidden message, some explanation for why she had left without a word. But there was nothing, just the cold, legal language of dissolution, the formal end of something that had died long before it was dissolved. He set the papers down and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had once felt like his kingdom, but now felt indifferent, vast, and uncaring. He realized then what he should have understood much sooner. Silence was not forgiveness, distance was not acceptance, and staying was not the same as choosing. Alina had stayed for years, but she had stopped choosing him long before she left. He had mistaken her endurance for love, her patience for commitment, her silence for peace. But all along she had been waiting, not for him to change, but for the right moment to leave. And when that moment came, she had taken it without hesitation, without drama, without giving him the chance to convince her otherwise. Vincent thought about the affair, about Gabriella, about the nights he'd spent chasing something he thought he needed. He realized now that what he'd been searching for wasn't in another woman or another life. It was something he'd lost within himself, something he'd traded away piece by piece in the pursuit of power and control. He had built an empire, commanded respect, wielded influence, but in doing so he had forgotten how to be human, and by the time he remembered, the person who might have reminded him was already gone. The ending came not with confrontation or reconciliation, but with acceptance. Alina never returned. She built a new life, one that didn't include him, and by all accounts she thrived. Vincent remained in the house that no longer felt like home, surrounded by the empire he'd built, powerful and alone. He learned to live with the absence, with the regret, with the quiet understanding that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. Gabriella faded into memory, a chapter that felt insignificant now in the face of what he'd truly lost. And Vincent, the man who had once believed he controlled everything, came to understand the limits of power. He could command loyalty through fear, respect through strength, obedience through force, but he could not command love. He could not control the heart of someone who had chosen to leave, and he could not undo the damage of years spent taking for granted the one person who truly mattered. The house remained empty, the marriage remained ended, and Vincent remained, learning too late that the most dangerous silence is not the one that precedes a storm, but the one that follows a departure, because that silence is final. That silence is the sound of someone who has already moved on, who has already chosen a life that doesn't include you, who has already found peace in your absence, and no amount of power, no amount of regret, no amount of late understanding can bring them back.